The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. This is Libby Krieger coming to you from the underground studio here at Grove City College, put on by the Institute for Faith and Freedom. We have no Aaron Jenks today, but instead we have a special guest, Luke Hassinger. Thank you so much for being here today, Luke.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be great. So Luke is a senior econ major at Grove City College, and first question here today is economics or economics? What is the correct way to say it?
That differs in the economics field. So I guess like I said, what my preference is on it. I say economics, but some individuals say economics. I think they're the same thing.
Okay, so expert opinion here today is economics, but you could do it if you want to be wrong and say economics.
Exactly. It's potato.
Okay, great. So getting more into it, you have some really interesting research here on libertarian paternalism. So that might sound like an oxymoron at first, but can you kind of give an overview of what that is, what you postulate, and why it's not an oxymoron?
Yeah, of course. Well, first off, again, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Glad you could be here.
I'm glad I have this platform to share the work that I've been doing over the past semester. So this should be fun. I guess as a disclaimer, though, I am far under educated on this idea and have underachieved this 10,000.
Still far more educated than I am on this. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, potentially, yes. So basically what libertarian paternalism is an offshoot of behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is this connection between psychology and economic principles. And a lot of people might say, well, isn't psychology already deeply rooted in economics? Yes, but it becomes more in the applied sector. So libertarian paternalism basically takes this idea that humans don't always act optimally or rationally. And that needs to be, thunk about when choice architects or people in policymaking responsibilities are actually making these decisions.
So it's almost like connecting how humans operate and understanding that into a mass scale of economic theory.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that does create challenges because controlling a lot of people or understanding the differences in every person is very difficult, especially when you're dealing with a whole world population. But the beauty of libertarian paternalism is that it can be applied both in the public and private sector. So really what behavioral economics and libertarian paternalism is trying to do is create is almost opening up the field for what they call nudges. And nudges are the ability for a choice architect or someone that are making decisions to change the environment that people are making decisions in. Not changing the choices, but changing the environment. And that's the important part, and that's where a lot of my research comes in.
Okay, great. So I'd like to start with a real-life example. I know one that is really commonly used is the lunchroom example.
Yeah.
And I know you've talked about that a little bit. So could you just explain that to give us a very tangible real-life example?
Of course, yeah. So Richard Thaler, the kind of founder or leading mind in the behavioral economics literature, speaks his first chapter of his book Nudge, which is a great book. I encourage you to take a look at it at some point, with this story about a lunchroom. So Richard Thaler talks about this individual that works in a school, and she's teamed up with a leading MBA student at a local college. And their job is to basically change the lunchroom without changing the choices that are given to the students. So one of the things that this lady is forced with is three basic decisions. Those aren't very important, but some of them are: do I arrange the food in an order that will, benefit me, benefit the other person, or possibly benefit a third party? And a third party being a company, maybe some kind of incentive structure could be created. But what Thaler is trying to say is that with just looking at this as simple a situation as a lunchroom, when you change the environment, when people make decisions, the decisions often are going to change. And that's a power could be for good or for bad. And I think that's what he opens up with. And I think this is where libertarian paternalism gets its strength, is the fact that we are able to nudge human beings in a certain way by changing the environment rather than the choice structure that they have.
So it's almost like in the lunchroom. She has the option to put either the fruit first or the dessert. And that will dictate. No, it doesn't take away the choice, but it kind of guides a person just in knowing how psychology works. What you see first, you're more likely to go for. And I think that's really interesting because one of the misconceptions that you have here in your notes, and a premise that for libertarian paternalism, is that there's no really neutral way of orienting things. And so once we understand that any way that we design a choice, there's always going to be a nudge in a certain direction. So it's understanding that and then going from there and trying to see how we can best orient the choice in a way that can have human flourishing. Is that kind of the goal?
Yeah, and I think, and you have it correct in assuming that, and that's the perfect layout that Thaler kind of lays out in his first chapter. And like I said earlier, this is an opportunity for gains, but it's also an opportunity for a lot of destruction. And destruction in a way that humans are their decisions are able to be manipulated in a way. And the libertarian paternalism part, a lot of people get the word paternalism wrong. They think it's control, but it's actually fatherly. So when you combine this idea of libertarian, which is basically in a way is added to understand that there's a freedom of choice, and this paternalism aspect is the talking more about leading people in a good or welfare promoting direction. So as a father, you can't, to some degree, you can make your kids not do something, but it's more about pushing them in the right direction.
Yeah, you have their best interest in mind.
That's exactly right.
And is this another example that I think we read in my poli-sci class, actually nudged by Thaler. Whenever you're looking at like organ donations and signing up for that, you can either have the system opt in or opt out. And just the status quo there dictates kind of what people are more likely to choose. If they really feel passionate about it, they'll likely do that either way. But lots of times people will just stick with the status quo because that's easier. Is that like another real life example?
Yeah, that's a really good example of a public application of a nudge. So that's known as defaulting. So when individuals are given the opportunity to sign up for organ donation when they get their license, these opt-in systems are created to trigger a certain heuristic, which a heuristic is basically a shortcoming of the brain to some extent in decision making with using a lack of information. So the brain sometimes acts without having optimization or full information, and that's what heuristics basically studies.
Wow. So looking at this theory writ large, what is it the alternative to? Is that more Austrian economics? Is that free market? And what's the difference between those two?
Well, I think a lot of my argument that I end up concluding in my paper is that there is actually a lot of compatibility between Austrian policymaking and the policymaking strategy that's laid out in libertarian paternalism. While there's still some inconsistencies in areas that I think probably can be tweaked or maybe aren't really compatible, for the most part, they both try to pursue the same thing, which is this freedom of choice. Where libertarian paternalism maybe is different is that there's more of a nudge. There's more of a nudge involved.
Yeah.
So I guess so looking at them as very similar, the alternative would actually just be more paternalistic or more control-oriented policymaking strategies, such as regulations or bans on stuff. Those are more concrete examples of policymaking, and that would probably be the alternative to what libertarian paternalism would promote.
Interesting. And you said that with libertarian paternalism, maybe there's more of a nudge, but since we recognize there is no face-neutral way of doing it, isn't it almost just the pure libertarian would almost argue you should just randomize it?
Yep.
So it's either a random nudge or a nudge in someone's best interest, assuming the people designing the choice have the best interest in mind.
Yeah, and that's one of the minor areas of libertarian paternalism that often comes under charge is that this idea that perfect people are not making the decisions in people's best interest. they can try, and that's what an entrepreneur does in the market is they try to forecast what people's demands are, and sometimes they're wrong. But for the most part, libertarian paternalism and nudges focus on the simplest things in the human condition, like making people healthier or happier or wealthier. These are all things that, in the simplest form, can be
Everyone
changed.
should want.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting. So I guess kind of going off of that, you said the biggest charge of it. So if we understand the premise is that humans don't act fully rationally, how can we put other humans in charge who also cannot act fully rationally in nudging people in the right direction? And who's to say what, I guess you kind of answered that last part, who can say what's the right direction because it's focusing on the smaller things. But if we also have an understanding of human nature in the sense that once power is given, it's rarely given back, and power corrupts, how can we be confident that once this more power is given to them to decide what is in the best interest, how can we be confident in that, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the biggest issues with libertarian paternalism, especially in my research, is that you're, again, handing off the decision-making to someone that can be irrational or unoptimized. But I think an important thing to recognize is the human brain is filled with biases and things that cloud our judgment. And Adam Smith talks about this in his first publication, A Theory of Moral Sentiments, is that he talks about this idea of an impartial spectator. So sometimes I think while people think they have their best interest in their mind, they don't. So what I'm saying is a third party sometimes can do a better job of looking at your situation.
Unbiased.
An unbiased look at and having more perspective and able to, and looking past those short-term biases or the status quo bias that we talked about earlier. And, looking past that and creating optimized solutions to fix those or to counteract them.
Interesting. I know whenever I was listening to another podcast on this topic, just trying to understand it more, one of the arguments, not against it, but against it in the public sphere was if we have this in the private sphere, individuals can still choose to work for a company that maybe has more libertarian paternalistic behaviors and tendencies. So you're still allowing that choice, but not implementing it into the public sphere. What's the argument for putting it in the public sphere?
So that's a good question. I think so a lot of my research was based in the private sector.
Okay.
But I think a good argument for it in the public sector would be a lot of libertarians and conservatives alike like to limit government, and I think Thaler's argument is a perfect example of a movement towards giving people more freedom to choose, and also just fulfilling people's wellness a lot better. So on a big scale, while it has its challenges, I think this is a super, super interesting alternative to the current policymaking strategy we have, where it focuses more on control, regulation, and open it more into a freedom-based system, and that focuses less on big government but better governance.
So is that basically your conclusion of your research, is that it doesn't have to necessarily go to be a big government approach, like maybe a lot of libertarians would originally see this idea as being, but just better governance in general?
Yeah, exactly. I think better governance is, and Thaler quotes that like almost exactly in his kind of the last paragraph going into the book is, we're not for big government, we're for better governance. And this is Libertarian paternalism is not a conservative idea or a liberal idea. It should be something that can be brought on by both. And I think both ideas and both political parties kind of have their own mental biases that prevent them from instituting stuff like this or instituting policies that are aligned with the principles. But Thaler argues that these things should be looked past for the well-being of humanity.
Yeah, and so I know how you mentioned one of the biggest arguments against this is just if we have people in charge who can't fully have our best interest in mind, or if they're corrupt or something like that. It almost goes back to that understanding of the republic itself only working for a moral and righteous people.
Exactly.
So if you have immoral people, this could actually work wonderfully. So that's just an interesting note, kind of connecting it to our system of government in general and the checks and balances you have there. Is there another example with Obamacare? Is that something that was happening, or is that not? I could be amiss on that.
So Obamacare being a form of
paternalism, or they messed that up in some way?
Yeah, so I think healthcare is one of these, an area that this has been applied to a lot.
Okay.
I'm not as educated in that area. I think from the outside, what is going on is we're maybe a more paternalistic way of policymaking is what happened here. So the administration possibly assumed that people's preferences aligned with what Obamacare provided, while maybe that's not what people wanted.
Okay.
And that's another area where I think all decision making, all policy making has this implication, which is when you are making a decision for someone else, you're assuming the preferences. And one thing that I've kind of come across in my research is that sometimes even the own person doesn't know their preferences, because again, we're very short-term people.
Oriented.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So so it's very difficult for someone, a policymaker, to sit there and say, well, we're trying to align our decisions best to their preferences, but if they're unknown or don't exist, it becomes very difficult.
And so you talk about the short-term preferences and how just human nature, we do think very short-term, and lots of us, it's hard to save, for example, money. Financials is the perfect example of long-term investments, and how it's hard for a lot of people to make those choices in the here and now. So I know Richard Thaler talks about this example with the Swedish social security system. Do you have any knowledge of that at all?
I think I have minimal knowledge.
Okay.
Most of my research is focused more on the 401k and the retirement savings account. Which I think goes hand in hand with what this Swedish account, or the Swedish Social Security is talking about. So I guess I can kind of give an outline.
Yeah, go down
of
the
that.
401k if you know.
Yeah. So prior to 1980, I believe, retirement savings accounts that were given or offered by your employer were very, very unpopular. They were still developing. A lot of people, pensions and retirement programs were, almost few and far between. And Thaler asked himself, and another behavioral economist came together and said, well, why is this happening? Employers are often matching these 401ks with, safe harbor matches, which are basically for a certain amount of money that you contribute to your retirement plan, a certain is matched by the company. So when you look at that, that's almost free money. I mean, you're obviously being incentivized to save into this retirement plan, but they're giving you money for doing that. And Thaler often asked, well, why are these very unpopular? And it is because of these, the mental biases. So, throughout his argument, he kind of, frames it as a story. So, before 1980, a lot of these handbooks that were given to new hires were extremely, they were very thick, and there was a lot of information asymmetry. So new employers would look at these and they would have no idea how to act. So this
almost too much information.
Yeah, exactly. Information overload. And what Thaler, Thaler looks at this and says, well, psychology tells us that when humans are given a lot of decisions to make or a lot of information, we often have the bias to not do anything. And this is why retirement plans were, under contributed to, and enrollment numbers were way down. So, and out of this idea, he said, well, an alternative would be to add a nudge. So a nudge to get people to enroll in the plan, because retirement is one of those things that's very, very important. And in the long run, it's very difficult, or in the short run, it's very difficult for people to understand that. But in the long run, people need to often look at it and say, well, now I'm glad I contributed because now I have a safe retirement. So now where the nudges came in is now it's defaulted. So when you are hired in a new place of employment, you are given the packet, but it clearly says at the top, if you don't do anything, if you don't sign your name, you're automatically being enrolled at this certain rate. And while a lot of behavioral economics is moving into what the rate should be, and more into that. As a whole, this is a perfect example of people taking a situation that maybe people were under-optimized in, and now they are recreating a situation or framing the situation to give people the best, benefit from it, which is more retirement savings.
Yeah, because I think you have to understand human nature and all of this. Human psychology,
Exactly.
human nature, it all goes together in how humans operate. Because, you can think of your own life. You're much more apt to do something if it's easy. And if you have to sign up for something by mailing something back, you're less likely to do that. So understanding humans being lazy is just kind of in our nature.
Exactly.
And the default choice and the status quo bias. I think it's so interesting that you've been able to, you and Thaler and Cass Sunstein, all these great economic minds have been able to synthesize all these aspects of understanding humans to try to orient it in the best way, policy-wise, for economics, for all of that. And I think it's something that conservatives, especially most of our listeners, are conservative.
Yep.
And we should definitely give this more thought, because I think lots of us immediately were like, free markets, Austrian economics, free markets is the end. And I think that has caused us a lot of issues as conservatives, especially those of us, I shouldn't say us with libertarian bend, because I don't think I have as much of a libertarian bend. But those of us, those conservatives who do have that, are very much free market as an end rather than the means to an end of human flourishing. And I think we should consider this as an alternative to human, or an end to human flourishing.
Of course.
For example, I know big tech. I know this isn't the politics isn't necessarily your area as much, but how much that has gotten conservatives who hold only to the free market in so much trouble, arguing against the big tech issues, because that has become almost a god in itself, is being free market, free market, free market. But if we actually understand that humans can't be fully rational, I think we'd come to a lot of different conclusions.
Yeah, exactly. And, rationally and optimally go hand in hand. And I think as you were talking, I just reminded myself of this idea that maybe libertarian paternalism isn't a perfect end either, and it's not a perfect alternative, but it's a movement towards a better alternative, which I think is what I see politics as, or the ideal in politics is the constant movement towards better and freer ideas.
Exactly.
And I think one minor thing that I can add in there is that, libertarian paternalism, my biggest issue with it is the fact that in order to design these nudges for people, you have to be it's very individualistic. So in order to get information on individuals, privacy comes into a big play. And I think that's somewhere where libertarian paternalism is maybe moving that could be dangerous, is this creation of very individualistic policies that require a lot of information gathering from the government, which could be, you can see this in big tech. And I talk about this a little bit in my paper, is that, it becomes a very large issue, and I can see why conservatives and people that just generally,
onto freedom and
exactly understand their private property and the fact that the information that they have is theirs. It's starting to become infringed upon, and I think that's a very dangerous direction that libertarian paternalism could be going. And we talked this at the beginning, is that it's a power, but it can be very destructive.
Yeah, and I think that's most things, though. Just
Exactly.
understanding human nature. You can use these tools for good, or if you have bad intentions, you can use them for evil. So,
Exactly.
Very interesting conversation, Luke. Thanks so much for being here today and educating me on libertarian paternalism.
Yeah, of
It's
course.
definitely
Thank
something
you
that
so
I
much.
haven't learned too much about before. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in today. Check us out on YouTube if you're watching this. Share it with your friends. Leave us a like. Subscribe. Hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post more content. And also listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get podcasts. And please share. And we'll see you here next week for another episode of Liberty Mail.
For more information on this podcast or other programs, please visit faithandfreedom.com.